To introduce James. James Riley is Research Fellow in English at University of Cambridge. His research interests include British and American literature, literary and critical theory, beat writers, cybernetics, counterculture in the 1960s, cult cinema and horror, terrorism, parapsychology and ufology. James also works closely with the archives of novelist and radical filmmaker Peter Whitehead. The outcomes of this research have to date included co-editing a special double issue of Framework in 2010 entitled Things Fall Apart, the Peter Whitehead issue, and a copy of that can be found in our study upstairs. So I'd like to welcome James and thank you all for coming.
Hi folks, thanks for coming. Thanks Emma for that introduction, and thanks also for having me back. Thanks also to Isabel for setting this up. As you heard there, I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes. Just to introduce this film, we are going to be seeing Warlords of Atlantis this evening, which is a tremendous film, kind of a trash epic, if you like. I hope you enjoy it. And I'm just going to talk for a little while about some of the issues that are linked to this film, and also the kind of, if you like, the subgenre of films linked to it. Okay, so the title of my talk then is Invisible Horizons, Hollywood's Voyage into Uncharted Waters. And I take this title from a book written in 1965 by Vincent Gaddis called Invisible Horizons, Strange Mysteries of the Sea. And this is an account of various unexplained occurrences in shipping lanes all over the world and other bizarre maritime phenomena. Now, all the way through this book, Gaddis writes with a certain level of sensationalism, but overall, his tone is essentially that of the rationalist. He tries to explain the unexplained. Describing himself here as a former newspaperman, Vincent H. Gaddis is a freelance writer who specialises in exploring the borderlands where fact emerges from myth and legend. Now, this book, Invisible Horizons, is best known for its inclusion of an early account of the various disappearances of planes and ships in the so-called Bermuda Triangle. Gaddis was one of the first people to write about this, and he actually gave that episode its name. He wrote about this in the February 1964 issue of the magazine Argosy. And in Invisible Horizons, in his attempt to allow fact to emerge from myth and legend, he quickly dismisses some of the suggested causes of the disappearances that were sent to him by readers of the original article. And these included all manner of wild things, from interference by flying saucers or something from outer space, to space warps that cause planes and ships to enter another dimension, and disintegrating rays from a 30,000-year-old Atlantean power plant. Now, that Gaddis disregards Atlantis and actually gives it no further mention in a book all about sea mysteries is slightly surprising, but not entirely unexpected. It's surprising because, as I'll go on to indicate in a short while, Gaddis was writing at a time when there was a peculiar critical mass of interest in the idea of a lost subaquatic continent. However, it's also an expected omission, because although Gaddis does deal with other Fortean topics, as Mary Celeste, sea ghosts and vanishing islands, he's always assessing evidence, trying to identify possible evidence, and attempting also to analyse testimony, however vague. By contrast, Atlantis doesn't really fit into this remit because it's always existed as a symbol and also an idea. That is, of course, an artist's impression of Atlantis. Okay? Consideration of the city, the island, or the continent of Atlantis would require Gaddis to explore a very different borderland from that which he posits at the outset of his book. This would not be a borderland where fact emerges from myth and legend, but a borderland where fact actually becomes myth and legend. Atlantis represents a zone of largely uncharted waters, a triangle formed out of the extreme edges of folklore, oceanography, and speculative archaeology. However much truth or fact was originally connected to this story, it's one that's been consistently mediated and elaborated upon since its first recorded reference in the 4th century BC. And certainly in the 20th and 21st centuries, film and cinema have acted as important agents in the maintenance of this mythic resonance. And Warlords of Atlantis, the film you're going to see tonight, is a key example of this. Recommended as adult entertainment. There it is, down at the bottom. So, in this talk then, by way of an extended introduction to the film, I'm not going to argue for or against the existence of Atlantis, but instead I'm going to actually focus on and discuss precisely this mythographic status. Okay? So basically what I'm going to be doing is talking a little bit about why I think Warlords of Atlantis is an interesting film, why I chose this over and above many other films I could have chosen. And with reference to other examples, and one film in particular, I'm going to consider something about the nature of Atlantis on the cinema screen. And hopefully I'm also going to use this to try and link these ideas to the overall theme of this season, aquaphobia. Okay? Now when compared with the tentacles and the fish gods of H.P. Lovecraft that we saw last week, the idea of an underwater city is perhaps not immediately horrific, okay? But when we begin to unpack and consider the symbolic life of Atlantis, we can find much that is phobic, okay? That which pertains to fear and to dread. Okay, so let's think about Warlords of Atlantis then. All right, despite my title focus on Hollywood, this is a British film released in 1978 by EMI, directed by Kevin Connor and starring Doug McClure. Connor and McClure had previously worked together on The Land That Time Forgot in 1975. They'd done it again in 1976 in At the Earth's Core. And they also got together again in 1977 for The People That Time Forgot. Okay? So Warlords then is part of this classic McClure quartet. Right? And it's very much made in this mould. It's a kind of fantasy romp involving late 19th century scientists, some incipient steampunkery, and a plot involving a search for prehistoric monsters that leads the characters to Atlantis. Now then, when the film was released in America by Columbia Pictures in May 1978 under the title Warlords of the Deep, this is a press pack about the film, it joined a pantheon of existing films that dealt with Atlantean themes and generic sub-aquatic worlds. These included The Undersea Kingdom from 1936, classic RKO serial, plus also The Siren of Atlantis from 1949. We had Atlantis, The Lost Continent from George Powell in 1961, which I'll be talking about a little bit more in just a minute. And we also had War Gods of the Deep, okay, in 1965. Now this is another film, another British film, which suffered something of a title change. It originally started life as City Under the Sea. Okay, and it was changed to the more, I suppose, give it a bit more oomph as War Gods of the Deep. That was a title it carried when it was released in America by American International Pictures. And presumably maybe something informing the decision to change the title of Warlords of Atlantis to Warlords of the Deep was perhaps meant to emulate this release, a kind of semi-sequel, if you like. At the same time, we also had all kinds of TV shows, things like Owen Allen's Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, and also Man from Atlantis, a TV show that aired just in 1977, just the year before Warlords of Atlantis itself was released. Now, ostensibly, Warlords, the film, can be seen to sit well within this subgenre. As with George Powell's The Lost Continents, Warlords makes use of the Lost World motif, in which Atlantis exists as a kind of mirror zone. Okay, that's to say, in both films, The Lost Continent and Warlords of Atlantis, Atlantis itself represents everything which the familiar Terran world is not. It's exotic and paradisical. It's mystical and ancient, as well as technologically advanced. It's also, in both films, associated with some kind of despotism and monstrosity, and is seen to face some kind of imminent destruction because of it. And in each film, the protagonists find themselves trapped in Atlantis, and their attempts take place alongside this impending doom. It forms a kind of time bomb narrative to the films. Now then, aside from these generic similarities, that's pretty much where the comparisons end. When we look a little bit closer, George Pal and Kevin Connor constructed their lost cities on the basis of very different sets of mythic architecture. The key difference is that George Pal draws on the tradition, and indeed most of the stock footage, of the Hollywood historical epic, to present Atlantis as this glorious city that rose and fell in the ancient past. In Warlords, by contrast, the Atlanteans are similarly ancient, but are encountered contemporaneously in the film's present at the turn of the 20th century. Atlantis in Connor's film represents a kind of occulted city-state, hidden under the ocean with the ability to influence the world. And as you'll see from the opening of the film, and I'm not really giving anything away here, they are possibly extraterrestrial in origin. Now then, the general idea of Atlantis is vague and certainly fluid enough to support these vastly different storylines and scenarios. And I guess you could argue this forms part of the attraction on the part of a variety of filmmakers. But what's interesting is that despite the B-movie, almost Saturday matinee-esque aspect of these scenarios, and also the generic the generic sort of nature of their plot structures, each film actually draws on quite specific elements of the Atlantean myth cycle. And as a result, they generate a subsequent level of symbolism that can be used to put the films into something of a productive dialogue. Let's see how we get on with this. Let's look at a trailer here for Pal's film. See how this works. Here we go. Fiddle about.
Atlantis, our mighty empire. The mystery of a mother empire which stretched her civilization to both sides of the Atlantic has been the fascinating subject of thousands of books and millions of words of controversy by science, literature, and even today's headlines. Suddenly, you are living thousands of years ago in a civilization even more advanced scientifically than our own. We created wonders for the good of mankind, then turned them into monsters. Atlantis is the story of those who, like today, would use the marvels of science to conquer and enslave. Atlantis is also a fabulous adventure into the unknown, the story of a daring youth who risked the terror of uncharted seas for a beautiful girl.
Listen to my sweetness. They do whisper.
For even in those days, love wasn't too different than it is today. This thing was Atlantis. A land of violent contrasts, amusing themselves at the expense of human agony, the terrible ordeals of fire and water. Atlantis, a world that worships strange gods of science, a science gone berserk in the dread house of fear. You will be a bore. Every day and every way you will become more and more like one. A diabolical laboratory where humans were transformed into half men, half beasts. Atlantis, a land that harnessed the power of a volcano's fiery heart and learned to store the energy of the sun in giant crystals, then used them to create secret weapons whose disintegrating rays could destroy the rest of the world. Atlantis, a civilization that advanced too far until nature turned its cataclysmic revolt
Okay, there we are. Our staggering action. Here we are in Atlantis. Let's get rid of this thing. All right. Okay, so I think the key phrase there for this kind of argument, obviously there's loads of really interesting things going on in that clip there. The thing I want to focus here on is this idea of Atlantis representing a mother empire. Okay, this idea of the source city is central, I think, to the mythic significance of Atlantis. If we move on here, in the first recorded reference to the continent in Plato's dialogue, the Timaeus, Critias and Socrates speak of Atlantis as an enormous island with a sophisticated, fully developed culture that constituted a great and wonderful empire. The city of Atlantis, as it's described, some 11 miles in diameter, is said to have been built on a topographic elevation, surrounded by a circular network of land and water and a complex system of canals, harbours and docks that led out to sea. Critias describes the single night of floods and earthquakes that destroyed the island, said to have occurred some 9,000 years prior to the dialogue, as an act of retribution on the part of the gods for the city's decadence and military aggression. Such behaviour was to be seen as a dilution of the Atlanteans' divine origins. Although Plato's account is somewhat fragmentary, his description of Atlantis presents us with a classic fall narrative, but a fall that besets an entire nation, the suggestion being that Atlantis constitutes a kind of primary civilization, an origin point. It is a mother empire in the sense of the crucible of mankind, and its loss represents humanity's exile from an idealized golden age. Now, given the philosophical role of Plato's dialogues, it's easy to read the Atlantis of Timaeus as an allegory of an ideal state, akin to the kind of ideas that we find in Plato's Republic. And certainly this is the way that Timaeus was received by subsequent generations of thinkers, particularly those of the European Renaissance. Philosophers like Thomas More, Tommaso Campanella, and Francis Bacon all used Atlantis as a hypothetical and, by extension, pedagogical utopia. An efficient thinking tool whereby the conceit of an idealized island, city, or state could be used as a kind of canvas on which to project and work through a set of ideas relating to government and society. And yet what was particular about Plato's description was its level of geographical specificity. In the dialogue, Socrates is not asked to sort of imagine this kind of hypothetical paradise, but he's instead informed that Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for Gibraltar, and was larger than Libya, then uses a phrase to describe the known part of Africa and also Asia. Travelling across the island permitted passage to what in the dialogue is called the opposite continent, which surrounded the true ocean. Possibility which, as Charles Berlitz observed, was seemingly vindicated by the eventual discovery of the opposite continent in 1492. As such, texts composed in the wake of Campanella and Bacon, such as Athanasius Kircher's Mundus Subterraneus from 1664, a massive study of the Earth's interior, took Atlantis as a historical and geographical reality and included a series of maps based on Plato's account. Now, this flickering status between creation metaphor and archaeological fact continued to oscillate in the work of subsequent writers, but was also synthesized to a degree in late 19th century works such as Ignatius Donnelly's encyclopedic Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, published in 1882 and then again as a revised edition in 1946. Antediluvian means before the flood, or more specifically, before the deluge. This much is consistent with Plato's account, but in Donnelly's text he intends for emphasis to be placed on the direct article of his title. The flood that destroys Atlantis is for Donnelly the flood, the one that inspires all others. His book attempts to argue that not only was Atlantis a specific place, but that its fall was a literal cataclysm, a washing down, a fall into water that through the dissemination of myth came to underpin all the religious systems of the world. As he says here, Atlantis was thus the true antediluvian world, the Garden of Eden, the gardens of Hesperides, the Elysian fields, the gardens of Alcinous, the Mesomphalos, the Olympos, the Asgard of the traditions of ancient nations, representing a universal memory of a great land where early mankind dwelt for ages in peace and happiness. Now, it's very much these ideas that Powell was drawing on for the Lost Continent. The script was written by Daniel Mainwaring, who adapted it from Sir Gerald Hargreaves' play from 1945, Atalantia, A Story of Atlantis. And if you've not seen that, it's basically the Timaeus, but with more singing. Now, not only does the film present us with Atlantis as this kind of ancient, expanding empire, but as with the speculative leap that's made in Donnelly's work, in the aftermath of its destruction, we see the few survivors disseminating into the world to establish the city's myth. But what about all these references to death rays, okay, and weird cults of science? Where does all that come from? Surely that is Hollywood concoction, right? Well, it sort of is, but not exactly. Plato, unfortunately, doesn't talk about death rays. There's no dialogue of the death ray in the Republic, and neither does Donnelly, okay? This material comes from a series of texts associated with the American clairvoyant Edgar Cayce. There he is, age 23. Cayce was born in Kentucky in 1877, and from 1902 until his death in 1945, he achieved a degree of fame as the so-called sleeping prophet. He possessed the apparent ability to place himself into a trance and oracle-like deliver pronouncements in relation to questions and consultations from the public. Many of these readings related to the past lives of those who consulted him, and from the mid-1920s, a consistent point of reference in these transcripts was Atlantis. Atlantis was for Cayce not just a primary civilization, but a kind of spiritual crucible from where souls, or to use his phrase, entities, are first made manifest before beginning their long cycle of reincarnation through the ages. Reincarnation was for Cayce also a process of repetition. Each entity brings into each incarnation a set of predominant and consistent tendencies. This was reflective of a kind of wider historical paradigm that went through his work, in which he saw a sort of successive ages rise and fall according to repeated cycles of technological hubris. In Cayce's system, Atlantis developed technology very similar to our own, okay, as we see in that quote there. All kinds of electrical devices, transportation, X-rays, and what he also calls the terrible crystal, and what he also calls elsewhere the Firestone. Whatever the precise nature of Cayce's abilities, his pronouncements have been taken by his followers as dire warnings regarding the technological trajectory of the 20th century. In Powell's film, these destructive crystals are not so much warnings as signifiers of the alien, and alien in the sense of other and unknown technology possessed by the Atlanteans, a sort of pagan sorcery that's destroyed and consigned to the past, along with the island. So the Lost Continent, then, Powell's film, draws upon but also acts as part of the enduring resonance of Atlantis as a myth. It helps to reiterate and maintain key elements of the cycle within the collective consciousness. A question we might want to ask at this point is what is actually being signified here? What is this particular incarnation of the myth actually about? If we take myth to mean a sort of symbolic discourse rather than just, an imaginary story or something that's untrue, what does the persistence of Atlantis in this particular form communicate? Well, I think the particular combination of elements that we've got here that actually make up the motif is very suggestive. We've got an image of an origin point that's associated with an ideal golden age. But at the same time, this harmonious birthplace is inaccessible, a classic lack, which of course renders it a symbol of extreme desire. Add to this the deeply resonant presence of the sea, and we end up with an archetype that expresses a desire for a lost sense of aquatic wholeness, a need to return to the sea. Sigmund Freud and his colleague Sandor Ferenczi saw this fantasy, and I'm using fantasy with a PH in the sense of wish fulfillment, saw this fantasy as an important element in the construction of the conscious mind. Freud saw it as a desire for that which he termed the oceanic, the sense of oneness and undifferentiated selfhood that we, from his perspective, instinctively associate with early infancy, maternal proximity, and before that, the experience of the womb. Ferenczi took this idea a little bit further in his 1924 book, Thalassa, the name of the Greek goddess associated with the sea, in which he argued, as Michel Bertrand summarises, that the individual catastrophe of birth duplicates the collective catastrophe of the drying up of the oceans, which finds reverse expression in the flood accounts of many cultures. In biblical and other cosmic narrative, the earth separates from the primitive ocean, of which the mother is symbol and substitute. So for a writer and a thinker like Ferenczi, the trauma of birth, which for all terrestrial species involves exile from the internal ocean, finds unconscious expression in deluge narratives. From this perspective, the permutations of Atlantis serve as ways to reimagine, to work through, to deal with this experience. Another way of interpreting the myth is to think about the word Atlantis itself. It means island of Atlas. And Atlas, as I'm sure you know, is the Titan, kind of prototypical god, who is charged with the task of holding up the earth. He's also associated with other forms of guidance like navigation and astronomy, and the name also reflects these roles. Etymologically, Atlas relates to hard and enduring. It's a name associated with mountains and that which upholds and supports. So it's not surprising then that Atlantis, as the island of Atlas, carries a similar symbolic function. As we've seen, it presented as a foundation culture, that which supports and forms the basis of human civilization, not a million miles away from the psychoanalytic interpretation of an ego origin. One interpretation pertains to cultural origin, the other pertains to individual origin. But I guess what's worth highlighting at this point is that both accounts carry with them phobic ideas. This is where we begin to see Atlantis as a symbolic source of fear and dread. In the Freudian reading, the desire for the sea also carries with it a sort of death drive, because to consummate the desire for a state of selflessness constitutes an obvious loss of self, a double bind neatly encapsulated by Atlantis' combination of paradise and disaster. In the case of Atlantis as humanity's ancestor, the fear here relates to the sense that humankind is significantly older and has a history significantly deeper than established records might suggest. This is the implication of Donnelly and also that of speculative archaeologists like Eric von Daniken. That Atlantis represents an antediluvian world that was also tremendously advanced suggests that its loss also involves the annihilation of entire chapters of human development. This vertigo, again neatly encapsulated by the idea of the titanic foundations of the world, is similar, if you like, to the horror of H.P. Lovecraft. As you might have seen last week, the fear he generates does not relate to the threat of his tentacled monsters per se, but the epistemological consequences of conceptualizing these old ones. The cosmic nature of Lovecraft's horror lies in the ontological results of factoring into existing knowledge that which is previously unknown. And you'll see a similar sense of this in next week's double bill, Creature from the Black Lagoon, and It Came from Beneath the Sea. The source of the aquaphobia in each of these films is not just the sense that the water contains something dangerous, but that the appearance of this something will, like the potential discovery of Atlantis, force us to reassess what we know and also who we are. Okay, so what light then does this shed on Warlords of Atlantis? Well, Connor's film does contain all of this interesting content and it pertains to these ideas, and you could easily see it through a similar frame of analysis. But as I said earlier, it also contains additional elements that mark it out from the Lost Continent. We've got this extraterrestrial scenario and this idea of a contemporaneous encounter. And I think these additions modify the myth somewhat, give us something a little bit more. Whilst Powell's film draws on the symbolic status of Atlantis as it's known up until 1960, Warlords was heavily influenced by the way in which the idea was discussed during the 1960s. Let's take a quick look at the trailer. Let's see if we can make this work again. This gives you an indication of what you're about to put yourselves through.
Back in the dawn of time, a strange traveler came from outer space and plunged beneath the sea. Through the centuries, countless ships have disappeared without trace in the Bermuda Triangle.
What's going on here? Where are we? Okay, hang on, let's rewind this.
A strange traveler came from outer space and plunged beneath the sea. Through the centuries, countless ships have disappeared without trace in the Bermuda Triangle. Yet there are men who still dare to probe the mysteries of these dangerous waters. The discovery of a fantastic hidden metropolis under the ocean leads to spectacular action and thrilling adventure in Warlords of Atlantis. Where are you going here? To safety. Starring Doug McClure, Peter Gilmore, the guest stars Sid Charisse and Daniel Massey.
Could not find it on any map. I didn't know its name.
Atlantis. They defy an underwater world of tyranny and terror.
From our dying planet, we journeyed across space. We brought our cities, our power and ambition. We are a master race.
Let's get out of here.
Damn, mister. There's no escape.
Let your mind join with us in the rhythms of our quest.
Serving the power of Atlantis. The power of Atlantis.
McClure and Peter Gilmore join forces to survive a living hell below, monster terror above.
There you are. Okay, so you're going to see all that and more in just a few minutes. Brilliant. Can't wait. Right. Okay. I'm always a fan of trailers that says it involves exciting action, right? Like, you've got to point that out, as opposed to a trailer that would say, really boring action. Don't bother even watching this. Okay. All right. So, part of the reason why it looks so exciting and why it's full of really interesting things, that it was screenplays by Brian Hales, okay? And he was an author who served his apprenticeship writing episodes of Doctor Who. Okay, so he really kind of knew his science fiction, knew his fantasy. In an essay called The Thinking Behind Atlantis, which was published in Paul Victor's novelisation of the film, released to coincide with its release, he called Warlords a science fiction adventure, but added that many of its concepts are valid beyond its immediate field of entertainment and link up with other unexplained mysteries. And in particular, as you saw there in the trailer, and certainly as you'll see when you watch the film, it brings together all kinds of interesting ideas. We've got Atlantis, we've got sea monsters, we've got the Bermuda Triangle, we've got shades of the Mary Celeste, as well as Casey's terrible crystals get a look in there as well. If in previous incarnations of Atlantis the city functioned as the crucible of humanity, here Atlantis functions as the crucible of the unexplained. It's not so much an invisible horizon as a kind of event horizon of sea mysteries. Now, Atlantis takes on this role in the mid to late 60s, in part due to the republication of Casey's work, combined with the serendipity of a number of archaeological discoveries. A book written and published by Casey's son, Edgar Casey, on Atlantis, appeared in 1968, containing transcripts of Casey's pronouncements, including this interesting one from 1940. He said, Poseidia, that's Casey saying Poseidia is a kind of suburb of Atlantis, will be amongst the first portion of Atlantis to rise again. Expect it in 68 or 69, not so far away. Note the language there, rise again, indicative not just of an elevation out of the sea and a sort of physical discovery, but we've got almost a sense of this kind of messianic second coming. Now, this claim and the popular validity of Casey was lent credence by a series of archaeological discoveries in 1967 and 1968, particularly those on the so-called Bimini Road in the Bahamas, which were widely reported as the discovery of genuine Atlantean remains. Now, the net effect of this exposure was an increased level of attention given to Atlantis by writers associated with what could be broadly termed occulture. The late 60s saw an increased level of interest in the occult, in magical practices, and the history of consciousness. Writers like John Michel drew into the sphere the public concern for sightings of UFOs, which had been consistent since 1947, as well as a renewed interest in older ideas of landscape, ley lines, and geomancy. His 1969 book, The View Over Atlantis, took the image of the lost city as a guiding symbol for his investigations into England's hidden networks. But other writers such as Charles Berlitz and Brad Steger took this argument one step further. Berlitz's The Mystery of Atlantis from 1969 and Steger's Atlantis Rising from 1973, both writers reference and speak about Plato and Donnelly. But their studies eschew the former's allegorical approach and the latter's retrospective historicism in favour of a predictive argument whereby the imminent rediscovery of Atlantis is offered as a harbinger of great change. As with Casey, they both see the ancient destruction of Atlantis as an event that foreshadows the negative trajectory of the 20th century. As Berlitz comments there at the start of his book, as mankind rushes headlong into the future and into limitless space, his horizons have also expanded backward. But this is not Donnelly's antiquarianism, but an implication that the consequences of the forward thrust of the 20th century have already been played out in the disasters of the past. In 1959, Carl Gustav Jung made similar observations in relation to the phenomena of UFO sightings. Unlike Berlitz and Steiger, he's more interested in diagnosing the phenomena than presenting speculative evidence for the phenomena's veracity. Nevertheless, he describes the reported appearance of UFOs as manifestations of psychic changes, which always appear at the end of one Platonic month and at the beginning of another. They are changes in the constellation of psychic dominance, of the archetypes or gods, which bring about long-lasting transformations of the collective psyche. We are now entering that great change which may be expected when the spring point enters Aquarius. So Jung's point is that UFOs, a modern version of things seen in the sky, are projections of the collective unconscious, a signpost that a psychic change is about to occur. What he means by the spring point entering Aquarius is a reference to the fact that every 2,000 years or so, the constellation against which the sun rises on the vernal equinox changes. The last shift from Aries to Pisces occurred sometime around the birth of Christ, and the shift from Pisces to Aquarius, the water bearer, has been long predicted for some time around 2000 AD. Jung is basically arguing that given this ingrained belief, various portents of doom are made manifest as a collective expression of millennial anxiety. Now, obviously, the age of Aquarius, there it is, has a certain currency in the 1960s counterculture. That's the song from the musical Hair. And it's basically there to mean the dawn of this glorious new age, very much the kind of golden age that Atlantis exemplified, and we've already spoken about. But it's also, by necessity, a time of strife and tribulation. You know, the new age is going to be born out of trauma. Okay? What we get in Berlitz and Steger, in a less diagnostic fashion than Jung, is an attempt to read archaeological discoveries and ancient myth for indications of the nature and form of this violent shift. Now, it's very much these ideas, these kind of almost apocalyptic ideas, that Hales is drawing on in his screenplay for Warlords. His Atlantis is not a vision of a glorious past, but a herald of a kind of proleptic, a forward-looking catastrophism. If you've not seen the film before, I'm not going to spoil it for you because it's a visionary sequence to rival 2001. But watch out for a sequence about 3/4 of the way through the film. It's almost like you don't believe me in that evaluation. But watch out for a sequence about 3/4 of the way through the film. We get this strange, almost kind of pseudo-psychedelic sequence. And in terms of the films dealing with catastrophe, we do have this film which is campy and it's B-movie-esque and it's a fun romp. But at that point in the film, it's kind of ironic, cynical, and almost nihilistic in its presentation and conviction that bad things are going to come in the century ahead. Now, obviously, I think evaluation is open to debate, but I think it's this aspect that makes Warlords the better Atlantis film than The Lost Continent. Powell's film is essentially a story of civilization's birth. Okay? Warlords, for all its campiness and B-movie action, is a story of civilization's end. I think that's an idea which is perhaps more apt for our current climate. Because, of course, Atlantis has arisen. Okay? There it is in Dubai, on the Palm Island. And it's not just there in Dubai, it's also there in a form that's remarkably similar to Plato's original description. Now, this appeared in 2008. Does this signify a return of a golden age or some kind of impending catastrophe? Well, consider the fact that it actually opened a mere 2 weeks, right? A mere 2 weeks after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, right? Okay, the symbolic start of the global financial crisis. I'm inclined to agree with the latter. I have a blog there with more things of this nature if you'd like to check it out. You can also contact me at that email address if you'd like to chat about it. But other than that, thanks for listening and enjoy the film. Thank you.